Video games have grown in scope by a lot in the last decade or so, at least in the AAA space. Open-world games in particular have become more prevalent, with the format once being used to generate hype through the implication of large settings that will satisfy the adventurous spirit of anyone who plays. Big open regions with many square kilometers of explorable land space was seen as a monument to a seamless or near-seamless experience. It was a novel concept in the early to mid-2000s when the additional scope and scale was seen as a benefit purely because of the fact it was achieved at all. But in the last few years, the label of open world has started to become more and more of a warning instead. There's definitely a formula that a lot of open world games have trended towards, perhaps without even trying to in some cases. Instead of being vast, bustling showcases of a variety of activities, a lot of open-world games are just big checklists that serve up a number of different ways to traverse and fight without actually offering anything truly divergent from the core gameplay loop. When creating and offering side missions or challenges, they're usually limited to just doing what you're normally doing anyway, but with more restrictions. In the best case, the new restrictions are at least interesting, or offer you new opponents or areas you might have otherwise not encountered, or even encourage playstyles you may not normally try in the usual content of the game. But in the worst case, the restrictions just make the activity boring and repetitive. Thus, these activities don't offer a way to engage with the game that's different on a fundamental level. They don't offer a new way to engage with the world. They might still be fun, but they also still adhere to the game's prevailing loop of just traversal, talking, and fighting. I know that some people might have the instinctive reaction of, not every open world game needs minigames. And yeah, it's true that not literally every single one needs the assistance provided by minigames to add more interactivity to the world. Some games get along perfectly fine without them, either through having deep combat or complex dialogue systems, or simply having a metric ton of small but flavorful details. But I absolutely believe that the inclusion of minigames would still help, even if just a tiny bit. I used to not give much attention to minigames, thinking they were all just time wasters and fodder for completionists. For some games that might still be true. But for some others, minigames are the ultimate form of adding life and personality to the setting itself. The first game to ever give me this feeling through its minigames, even though I was too young at the time to describe why it worked so well from my perspective, was Final Fantasy VIII, the entry in the series that introduced the world to Triple Triad, a grid-based card game, where the goal was to strategically place stronger cards next to your opponents to flip them over to your side, and whoever owns the most cards when the grid is full wins. The game itself was really fun to little child me, but it wasn't until later that I truly appreciated how deeply entwined Triple Triad was with the rest of the game. First, Triple Triad is a very useful way to make your characters stronger thanks to the way the junction system works. You can obtain very strong cards from opponents, then transform those cards into high-level items, which in turn can be transformed into ultra-powerful magic spells to equip to your party to boost their stats by incredible amounts. Second, Triple Triad had a global presence in-universe, and each city in each continent had their own unique rules for playing the game, their own Triple Triad culture. It really drove the point home how popular of a game it was in this world. Every time I challenged a different NPC to Triple Triad, they had their own unique response and their own deck. Furthermore, if you lose to an NPC and they take a card, you can likely challenge them again later to get your card back. The game keeps track of who has your card. And third, there are several long and short-term subplots surrounding Triple Triad 2. Basically, Triple Triad wasn't just a brief little distraction to focus on after several hours of story progress and battling. It was a thriving aspect of the in-game world that all other NPCs were participating in like normal people, and you can join them at your pace whenever you wished. This is exactly how minigames can contribute to the liveliness of a game's setting, by making you not just the hero of the story, but a participant within the community. The main character's journey to defeat evil is something only a fateful few other people in the story can join in on, but the main character themselves taking a breather to play some cards with random people on the street, that's something any nameless NPC can help with. This ability, the option to directly engage with the less important stuff around you, is what closes the gap between the player and the world they're adventuring in. As more detail and different types of interactivity are added to the world, the less the player views the world as just a cluster of levels and objectives, and more like a living, breathing place. Card games in general are a pretty easy, simple way to check minigame requirements off the content list too. They can be normal, real-life card games like poker, or they can be original games, as complex as Triple Triad or Gwent, or as simple as Pazak in Knights of the Old Republic, which is basically just an offshoot of blackjack. Let's discuss another series that does an excellent job at minigames. Like a Dragon, recently known as Yakuza here in the West. Essentially, the entire mainline series and multiple spin-offs take place either fully or partially, depending on the game, in one district of Tokyo, Kamurocho. Yes, this means environmental assets are commonly reused between games. The idea of a video game series taking place in one somewhat small area for at least 10 games sounds like a recipe for disaster. You would think it would turn stale quick and end up being an obvious mistake. But it wasn't one. In almost every Like a Dragon title, Kamurocho is stuffed with so much content, often varying from game to game, that many fans of the franchise have grown to accept the district as a character in itself. It's the franchise's home, and is easily distinguishable from any other game that takes place in modern-day Japan or a comparable analog. No matter how many times I walk through the familiar streets of Kamurocho, I am always in awe at the incredible detail, not just visually, but interactively as well. Yakuza 0 was, and probably still is, the most popular game in the franchise. Not only does it have fun combat, a gripping crime story, hilarious side missions, and a cast of amazing characters, it has a fuck ton of minigames, as almost every installment does. You can shoot pool, throw darts, gamble in games like poker and blackjack, or Japanese gambling games like oichokabu or koi koi. You can spend 9 straight hours learning how to play mahjong, or you can hit up the arcade to play real-life Sega games. Seriously. But even beyond those, Yakuza 0 has 2 huge, fully fleshed out minigames that have their own isolated narratives tied to them. Cabaret Club Czar and Real Estate Royale. They're minigames with enough surprising depth that, with just a little bit more of extra expansion to their respective stories, they could be turned into inexpensive standalone games. They're easy to get into and positively addictive, and every time I play through Yakuza 0, I need to stop what I'm doing and dedicate multiple, non-stop hours to them once I finally unlock them. They're just too good to not do that. When you start them, it's like you're teleported into a totally different game. You're now interacting with an aspect of Like a Dragon's world that's totally unrelated to the main story, to the point where the gameplay loop isn't even the same genre anymore. Now let's take a walk in the opposite direction and talk about games that lack minigames but could have benefited from them. I recently did a review of Bethesda Game Studios' Starfield, a spacefaring sci-fi game with immense scope. I was disappointed with a lot of it, but one thing I didn't mention in the review was the Red Mile, an in-game casino and combat challenge. The challenge is pretty straightforward. You run up a mountain to hit a button and run back while avoiding hostile fauna that can bombard you with long-range attacks. It is as simple as it sounds, but also as boring as it sounds. The attacks can stun lock you out of reloading your weapon, so it's best to just run past everything and return. There's no real reward for engaging with the hostile alien beasts anyway. It was disappointing to say the least, due in no small part to other NPCs around the game hyping it up as the ultimate, most dangerous thrill. But now you might be thinking, well, if the challenge isn't fun, at least there's casino games to play, right? Wrong. Despite being the only casino area in the entire game, you can't play any actual casino games. No slots, no blackjack, no roulette, nothing. You can't even place bets on other people attempting the challenge. Now some of you might say, oh, but Starfield has ship and outpost building. Those are minigames, right? On some level, yes, I would say they are. But not in the same way poker is. When you create a new ship or set up an outpost, you are creating new content for yourself to use or interact with. But when you walk up to a poker table occupied by NPCs, you're directly interacting with an established aspect of the world around you that was already there and being used by other characters. It's especially significant when the NPCs are designed to react to how you play. That's the key difference. With the poker table, you're socializing with the world of the game, so to speak. Now, on the other side of the same coin, there's a game that I really did like that also unfortunately lacked minigames, despite the franchise being quite tied to them. Final Fantasy XVI. Structurally, it's not open world, but it still has fairly big regions and multiple towns or villages to wander around in. This game was made by the Creative Business Unit 3 team of Square Enix, who are responsible for the MMO Final Fantasy XIV. As you may know, 14 is crammed with minigames, which shouldn't be a surprise considering it's a decade-old online game still receiving big updates and expansions. But because of the relationship the game has with 16, people wondered if the new single-player game would have any minigames of its own like many of its predecessors did. Unfortunately, producer Naoki Yoshida, aka Yoshi P, stated before the game came out that no, 16 would not have any minigames, as he felt it would be at odds with the very grim and serious nature of the setting and narrative. This is one of the few things I truly, wholeheartedly disagreed with him on initially, but after playing the game, my feelings only amplified. Final Fantasy X was a pretty bleak world, one where the populace is under constant attack and catastrophe by a cosmic entity that somehow always returns after being slayed. But that didn't stop them from having Blitzball, a sport that is stated in-game to be the only thing that gives everyone happiness and briefly takes their mind off their suffering. As a minigame, Blitzball is pretty divisive, but it is there, and it's extremely different from normal gameplay. If you do manage to get into it, you can spend hours playing it and forming an unstoppable team as you continue through the story. In my review of Final Fantasy XVI, I remarked on how much lore was written for the game. There was basically an entire encyclopedia's worth of information already inside it. It's clear as day the writing team cared about giving the setting as much history and heft as possible. It's all extra detail about the world that you can see and hear, and that's all well and good, but none of it was detail you could interact with. Video games are an interactive medium, so it's one thing to tell the player that the world around them has depth, but it's another to let them engage with it directly. Purely as an example, imagine if 16 had Triple Triad again, or a comparable card game, or even a board game instead, and there was a continuous subplot that lasts throughout the main story where Clive partakes in high-stakes games around Valisthea, using this activity to meet and help bearers he would have otherwise missed. Sure, there is a chance it might clash with the harsh seriousness of the central narrative, but it also would have added much-needed variety to the very stale and monotonous collection of side missions we actually ended up receiving. And it puts Clive and the player in a totally different aspect of the world that requires a new set of context. 16 had a lot of robust world and character building in its optional questlines, but it was all behind the barrier of just doing more running around and fighting in the same areas. It was sadly very fetch questy in nature. More combat is not an inherently bad idea in a game where the combat is really fun, and I say as much in the review, but at the same time, it feels kind of wasteful of the setting that clearly had a lot of thought and effort put into it. It feels like opportunities were missed when the game gives you painstaking detail on everything around you, yet the only thing you can do is talk with no consequential dialogue choices and fight things. Of course, all of this is not to say every large or open world game needs to commit to minigames so strongly that they're comparable to Final Fantasy VIII's extremely deep triple triad implementation or Like a Dragon's insane assortment. That could be a tall order for a lot of developers who are already swamped with simply making the base game. And as I said earlier, plenty of games get by just fine without minigames. They have either very deep combat with an incredible amount of variety for different playstyles, or just a ton of small but distinct interactions that add flavor to the experience. Or they could have very strong dialogue systems with lots of speech checks. So in a way, talking is kind of a minigame, and a very consequential one at that. All it truly boils down to is offering different ways for the player to interact with the world around them, big and small, blurring the line between the setting feeling like a manufactured playground and feeling like a true living world. And minigames can help with that by offering more ways to engage with aspects of the world that aren't just more of the core gameplay loop you've already been participating in for hours. This is why I've grown to become so appreciative of minigames over the last several years, whether they're simple and straightforward or complex and given entire subplots. I'm always welcoming of additional ways to immerse myself in my immediate surroundings and become more attached to the universe the developers created. This concludes my thoughts on minigames. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.